Under the golden lights of our first anniversary party, I prepared to announce my pregnancy. Suddenly, a stranger walked in holding my medical files. He looked at my husband and declared, "That unborn baby is mine." The entire room waited for my husband to throw me out on the spot. Instead, what he did next completely shattered the evening and ignited the absolute destruction of the wealthy dynasty that tried to bury my honor. My name is Kayla Mitchell, and I am 31 years old. Tonight, I am exactly 14 weeks pregnant. That was the secret keeping my heart racing beneath the heavy silk of my emerald evening gown. I stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sea Glass Hall. The Barron family's sprawling, modern coastal estate situated on the jagged cliffs of Blackwater Point, South Carolina. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the rocks in a rhythmic, violent dance. But inside, everything was encased in a golden, temperature-controlled bubble of extreme wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting warm, fractured light over the faces of the most powerful people on the eastern seaboard. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided silently across the polished marble floors, balancing silver trays of caviar and champagne. It was the celebration of our one-year wedding anniversary. I had planned this evening down to the very last detail, holding on to the news of my pregnancy tightly, waiting for the absolute perfect moment to share it. I wanted to wait until the dinner concluded, right after the main toast, to stand beside my husband and tell him and the rest of his formidable family that the Barron lineage had a new generation on the way. I wanted to turn this night into the single most beautiful memory of my life. Miles appeared at my side, his presence a sudden, warm comfort against the cool draft of the glass pane. He handed me a crystal flute filled with sparkling apple cider that looked identical to the vintage champagne flowing freely around us. "Are you holding up all right, Mrs. Barron?" Miles asked, his voice low and incredibly gentle. His hand found the small of my back, his thumb drawing slow, soothing circles against the silk of my dress. "I am perfect," I replied, smiling up into his dark, tired eyes. He looked undeniably handsome in his tailored tuxedo, the sharp lines of the suit accentuating his broad shoulders. But as I looked closer, I could see the faint tension vibrating through his jawline. Miles was the golden boy of the Barron Harbors Development Group, yet lately, the weight of the crown was crushing him. His father, Vernon, had spent the entire evening pulling him into quiet corners with ultra-wealthy real estate developers and predatory hedge fund managers. I knew the family was relentlessly pressuring him about aggressive expansions, offshore accounts, and the suffocating strings attached to his inheritance. He was trying so hard to protect me from their corporate bloodlust, but I could feel it radiating off him. The room was a curated museum of old money and generational power. The guest list was meticulously crafted by my mother-in-law to showcase the family's reigning supremacy. There were state senators laughing over scotch, blue blood relatives dripping in inherited diamonds, and the inner circle of the Barron corporate empire. They all spoke in that distinct, hushed cadence of the ultra-rich, a language of mergers, acquisitions, and summer homes in Martha's Vineyard. Across the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits, my gaze caught the sharp, unrelenting stare of Celeste Barron. My mother-in-law stood by the grand fireplace, a striking figure in silver satin, holding a martini glass like it was a weapon. Her eyes, pale and calculating, locked onto mine. There was no warmth in her expression, only a chilling, clinical assessment. She looked at me the way an auditor looks at a discrepancy in a ledger. She was waiting. She had been waiting since the day Miles brought me home to Dayton, Ohio, waiting for the moment I would finally slip up, embarrass the family, and prove I was exactly the gold-digging outsider she always claimed I was. I broke eye contact first, taking a slow sip of my cider to wash down the sudden dryness in my throat. I had to remind myself to breathe. "I am Kayla Mitchell," I told myself silently. I built my own career. I fought for everything I have. I crossed a massive chasm of social class and sheer prejudice to stand in this room, wearing this dress, holding the hand of the man I love. I absolutely refuse to let the toxic, suffocating bitterness of his family ruin my perfect evening. Well, do you not look just domestic, standing here quietly by the window? The voice sliced through my quiet affirmations. I turned to see Audrey, Miles's younger sister, stepping into our personal space. She wore a backless crimson dress that screamed for attention, her blonde hair perfectly blown out. Audrey possessed the kind of effortless cruelty that only comes from never being told no in your entire life. "It is a lovely party, Audrey," I said, keeping my tone flawlessly polite. "Your mother outdid herself with the floral arrangements." Audrey waved a manicured hand dismissively, her eyes raking over my figure. "Mother is a perfectionist. She insists everything in the Barron house belongs exactly where it is placed. Speaking of belonging, you must be feeling the pressure tonight." Kayla, 1 year down. The board of directors was just joking with father that Miles needs to secure his position in the trust. You know, produce a proper heir for the bloodline before the fiscal year ends. It is simply how old money works. "I am sure you are trying your absolute best." Her words were laced with a venomous sweetness, a half-joke meant to humiliate. A cold spike of unease drove itself directly into my stomach. It was a bizarre, oddly specific comment. Did she know? No. It was impossible. I had not even told my own mother yet. I hid the sudden panic behind a practiced, serene smile. Miles stepped between us, his voice losing all its previous warmth. "Audrey, that is enough. Go bother someone else about the trust." Audrey offered a dramatic, innocent pout, swirling the olive in her glass. "Just making conversation. Brother dear, relax. We are all family here." She turned on her heel and glided back into the crowd, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and lingering dread. "Do not listen to a word she says," Miles murmured, leaning in to kiss my temple. "She is just miserable. Tonight is about us. Only us." "I know," I whispered, resting my hand flat against my stomach, feeling a sudden, fierce protective instinct over the tiny life growing inside me. "I love you, Miles. I love you more," he promised. 2 hours later, the extravagant 5-course dinner was winding to a close. The massive mahogany dining table stretched endlessly, covered in wilting white roses, half-empty wine glasses, and the remnants of a dessert course I'd been too nervous to eat. The low hum of conversation filled the grand dining room. Then, the sharp, clear ringing of silver-striking crystal echoed through the space. Miles was standing at the head of the table, tapping his glass with a dessert spoon. The chatter immediately died down, replaced by the rustle of expensive fabrics as dozens of faces turned toward him. The silence in the room was absolute, commanded effortlessly by my husband. He looked down at me, his eyes shining with an immense, unwavering affection. The exhaustion from earlier had vanished, replaced by a radiant pride. "Family, friends, esteemed guests," Miles began, his voice projecting smoothly across the length of the hall. 1 year ago, I made the single greatest decision of my life. I married a woman who challenges me, who inspires me, and who loves me with an honesty I did not know existed. Kayla, you are my compass." A polite, restrained applause rippled through the guests. I felt the heat rising to my cheeks. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was it. The moment had arrived. I took a deep breath, placing my hand deliberately over my lower abdomen. I prepared to stand up, to take his hand, to look out at the sea of judgmental faces and announce that our family of 2 was becoming 3. I was ready to claim my space, to cement my undeniable place in this world, to step into the brightest, most beautiful chapter of my life. I shifted my weight, the silk of my dress rustling, a bright, triumphant smile forming on my lips. Then, with a violent, deafening crack, the massive double oak doors at the entrance of the dining hall burst wide open. The heavy oak doors slamming against the walls sent a physical shockwave through the dining hall. the sudden, violent noise shattered the refined silence of our anniversary toast. As every head in the room snapped toward the entrance, time seemed to stretch, pulling my mind back through the grueling path that had led me to this exact, precarious second. To truly grasp the gravity of this room and the hostility radiating from the people sitting at that table, you have to understand the miles of jagged glass I walked over to get here. I did not inherit my place at a mahogany dining table overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. I was raised in Dayton, Ohio. My father drove a commercial delivery truck for 35 years, waking up at 4 a.m. to haul freight across state lines. My mother managed a local bakery, coming home with flour dusting her eyelashes and her hands smelling of yeast and burnt sugar. We lived in a modest aluminum-sided house where the furnace hummed loudly all winter and the front porch creaked under the weight of honest, exhausting labor. We measured our wealth in loyalty, discipline, and paying our utility bills exactly on time. We did not have generational wealth. We had unyielding pride. I carried that fierce, blue-collar grit straight into the cutthroat corporate world. I clawed my way through a demanding state university on academic scholarships, working double shifts at diners serving coffee to truckers just to buy my textbooks. I fought tooth and nail until I secured a position at Harbor Ledger Advisory. We were an elite risk analysis firm, the kind of place major corporations called when they suspected their own executives of stealing. I quickly built a reputation as a relentless hound for financial discrepancies. I possessed a distinct knack for staring at thousands of lines of seemingly innocent data and pulling out the single, microscopic thread that unraveled massive corporate frauds. I saw the ugly stories that pristine numbers tried to hide. That exact skill set was how I met the heir to the barren empire. 2 years ago, my firm was hired to audit a complex web of internal contracts ahead of a massive real estate acquisition by the Barren Harbors Development Group. Their lawyers put me in a freezing, glass-walled conference room in Manhattan for 3 straight weeks, feeding me boxes of redacted documents. On the 21st day, Miles walked in. He expected a quick meeting, a rubber stamp on his family's supposedly flawless paperwork from an intimidated junior analyst. Instead, I slid a red-lined folder across the polished table. I met his gaze and told him plainly that a subsidiary holding company was masking a massive, toxic liability. I did not blink. I did not soften my tone to accommodate his billionaire surname. I treated him exactly like any other client who was about to make a catastrophic mistake. He was utterly captivated. Miles had spent his entire 33 years surrounded by people who nodded enthusiastically at his every word. He lived in an echo chamber of sycophants who laughed too hard at his jokes and society women who saw his last name as a winning lottery ticket. I was none of those things. I challenged his assumptions. I told him when his logic was flawed. And I never, not even once, asked him to buy me a single drink or leverage his connections for my career. He fell in love with my spine, my absolute refusal to be dazzled by the zeros in his portfolio. However, the exact qualities that made Miles fall desperately in love with me were the very reasons his mother, Celeste, viewed me as a terminal disease infecting her perfect lineage. To the old money Barron family, a wife was supposed to be a decorative accessory, a pedigreed mare brought in to improve the stock, host charity galas, and smile politely while the men ran the world. For years, Celeste had carefully orchestrated a match between Miles and Lena Sloan. Lena was the impossibly thin, perfectly bred daughter of a massive international shipping magnate. A marriage to Lena would have seamlessly consolidated 2 titanic East Coast fortunes and solidified a web of lucrative, under-the-table trade routes between their respective companies. I was the rusty wrench thrown directly into the gears of a billion-dollar machine. I was an anomaly they could not control. When Miles proposed to me with a brilliant diamond ring he bought himself, entirely independent of the family vault, the Cold War officially began. Before the ink was even dry on our wedding invitations, Celeste summoned me to her private office. She sat behind an antique desk and presented me with a prenuptial agreement thicker than a telephone directory. It dictated terms so draconian they bordered on medieval. If we divorced, I would walk away with absolutely nothing but the clothes I brought into the marriage. There would be no spousal support, no property rights, and a strict gag order that would ruin me financially if I ever spoke about the inner workings of the family. "Sign it," Celeste had demanded, her voice like cracking ice. "Prove you are not here for our money." I took her silver pen and signed it without reading past the third page. I truly did not care about their fortune. I wanted Miles, not his bank accounts. But I drew hard, unyielding lines in the sand where my own autonomy was concerned. I absolutely refused to quit my job at Harbor Ledger Advisory. Celeste had offered me an absurdly high monthly allowance, an amount reaching into the tens of thousands of dollars, just to sit at home, shop, and arrange flowers for her country club events. I declined instantly. I told her my brain was not for sale. Furthermore, I explicitly forbade the Barrons from attempting to help my parents back in Ohio. During our engagement, Vernon Barron had tried to quietly pay off my parents' mortgage through an obscure shell corporation, framing it as a generous wedding gift. I found the transaction, tracked the routing numbers through 3 different banks, and reversed the wire transfer within 48 hours. I called Vernon directly and told him to never touch my family's finances again. My family's dignity was not a commodity, and I would absolutely not let the Barrons purchase my silence or my loyalty by making my parents financially beholden to their empire. Over the past 12 months of navigating these shark-infested waters of extreme wealth, a terrifying, crystalline clarity had settled over my mind. Sitting at Sunday dinners and attending corporate retreats, I finally understood the true, insidious nature of their hatred. It was never merely about my lack of a pedigree. It was not about the fact that I bought my clothes off the rack before marrying Miles, or that I did not know the difference between a salad fork and a dessert fork. Those were surface-level insults, easy weapons for women like Audrey to use at cocktail parties. The real terror keeping Celeste awake at night was the threat of lost control. I was a woman who could read their ledgers. I was a woman who understood exactly how their shell companies operated, how they hid their assets offshore, and how they manipulated the local real estate market. I was entirely immune to their financial coercion because I knew how to survive on a fraction of what they spent on a weekend getaway. But most importantly, I was now a permanent, legal fixture in their ecosystem. As I stood there in the magnificent dining hall, my hand resting protectively over my 14-week-old secret, the ultimate truth locked into place. The Barrons were not afraid of me ruining their fancy dinners with my working-class manners. They were absolutely, fundamentally terrified of me giving birth. They were terrified of me producing a child who would carry the Barron name, who would have an undeniable, legally binding claim to the massive family trust, and who would be raised by a mother they could not manipulate, bribe, or destroy. They feared my Dayton blood mixing with theirs, creating an heir who would look at their corrupt legacy through my analytical, unyielding eyes. That was the unforgivable sin I had committed simply by existing, loving Miles, and refusing to bow down. And as the heavy dining room doors remained frozen open, the draft from the hallway cutting through the stifling heat of the room, I realized that the Barron family's quiet desperation to excise me from their bloodline was about to manifest right in front of me. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, waiting for the nightmare to step across the threshold. The man who stepped over the threshold did not look like a deranged stalker, a drunken party crasher, or a madman seeking 15 minutes of fame. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his hair neatly parted, and his posture rigidly controlled. His name, as the entire world would soon find out, was Wade Coulter. He walked straight down the center of the grand dining hall, his leather shoes clicking against the polished marble with a terrifying, rhythmic purpose. He bypassed the perimeter of shocked security personnel and ignored the gasps of the 200 guests. He walked as if he had memorized a floor plan, moving with an unnerving, icy calm directly toward the head of the table where my husband and I stood. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not ask for a moment of our time. He stopped exactly 6 feet away from me, his eyes locking onto mine with a vacant, rehearsed intensity. "I cannot sit back and watch this happen," Wade declared, his voice booming over the remnants of the anniversary toast, echoing against the vaulted ceilings. "I will not remain silent while my own flesh and blood is publicly claimed by another man." The reaction was not immediate chaos. It was a profound, suffocating paralysis. The entire room went dead silent. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain ceased entirely. Waiters froze in the middle of pouring wine. A few guests in the back rows exchanged nervous, tentative smiles, clearly assuming this was an incredibly tasteless piece of performance art, or perhaps a bizarre prank arranged by a rival corporate firm. I felt the air leave my lungs. My hand, still resting proudly on my stomach, suddenly felt like a lead weight. Before anyone could fully process the sheer audacity of his words, Wade reached inside his tailored jacket. He withdrew a thick, overstuffed manila envelope and slammed it down violently onto the pristine white linen of the dining table, right between a centerpiece of white roses and a silver champagne bucket. The heavy slap of the paper sounded like a gunshot. "Miles was in London for 3.5 weeks this past autumn," Wade said, projecting his voice toward the crowd while keeping his eyes fixed on me. "While he was busy acquiring shipping yards, his wife and I were together. The baby she is carrying right now is the direct result of our relationship." The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 50 degrees. The collective gasp from the surrounding tables was audible. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to call him a liar, but my vocal cords were paralyzed by sheer, unadulterated shock. I had never seen this man in my entire life. Wade did not wait for my denial. He reached into the open envelope and began dealing glossy, 8x10 photographs across the mahogany table like a blackjack dealer handing out a losing hand. "Here she is waiting for me outside the lobby of the St. Regis," he announced, tossing down a high-resolution image. I stared at the photograph. It was me. I was wearing my beige trench coat, looking down at my phone. It was taken from across the street, capturing me standing under the hotel's gilded awning. "And here we are together," he said, throwing down another print. This one showed the interior of a dark sedan. I was sitting in the passenger seat, my profile clearly illuminated by a street lamp, while Wade sat in the driver's seat next to me. The breath caught in my throat. How was that possible? My mind raced violently, trying to piece together the fragmented reality. I had taken dozens of ride shares in the past few months. Had he been a driver? Had someone manipulated the image? The lighting looked flawless, but the context was entirely fabricated. To the naked eye of a billionaire investor primed to hate me, it looked exactly like two lovers slipping away into the night. But Wade was not finished. The photos were merely the appetizer. He reached deeper into the folder and pulled out a stack of stark white papers, heavily stamped with blue ink. "I know she is exactly 14 weeks and 2 days pregnant," Wade stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable confidence. He held up the papers so the closest guests could see the letterhead. It was the distinct logo of my highly exclusive concierge medical clinic. "Because I have the prenatal records right here. The timelines match perfectly with the nights we spent together in October." A wave of dizzying nausea hit me so hard I had to grab the edge of the table to keep my knees from buckling. Those were my actual medical files. I recognized the formatting, the specific typeface my obstetrician used for lab results. Someone had actively breached my private medical portal, stolen my most intimate health data, and handed it to a stranger to weaponize against me in front of the most powerful people on the East Coast. "He is insane," I finally choked out, my voice trembling, sounding tragically weak even to my own ears. "Miles, I have no idea who this person is." Wade completely ignored my plea, turning his attention to the wider audience, playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken father with sickening perfection. "I know things about her pregnancy that only a partner would know. It has been a nightmare for her. The morning sickness hits her the second she opens her eyes. She cannot stomach a single piece of solid food before 10 in the morning, relying entirely on steeped ginger tea and dry sourdough toast. And if she gets even a slight scent of roasted garlic anywhere in the house, she is violently ill for hours. The room collectively stopped breathing. I felt the blood drain entirely from my face. He knew. He actually knew. Just 4 days ago, our private chef had begun roasting garlic for a marrow dish, and I had barely made it to the master bathroom in time. The ginger tea was a specific remedy my mother had suggested over a private phone call, something I kept hidden in my personal pantry. These were microscopic, deeply private details of my daily suffering, things I had aggressively hidden from my mother-in-law and the rest of the family to avoid showing any signs of weakness. By speaking those exact truths aloud, Wade instantly crossed the boundary from a delusional stalker with fake photos to an intimate confidant, in the eyes of the 200 guests staring at me. He possessed the undeniable currency of truth. The heavy, thudding footsteps of the estate's private security team finally broke the trance. 4 massive men in black suits descended upon the dining area, moving aggressively toward Wade, their hands reaching out to physically drag him from the room. "Stop right there." The command was not a shout, but a low, gravelly growl that carried absolute authority. It came from Vernon Barron. My father-in-law stood up from his chair, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo with maddening slowness. He looked at the security guards and raised one finger. "Do not lay a single finger on that man," Vernon ordered, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. He did not look at me. He looked directly at the crowd of investors and politicians. "If you drag him out of here by the collar, it will be all over the morning papers that the barons silenced their accusers with physical force. We do not do cover-ups in this family. Let the man finish his piece." My heart shattered against my ribs. Vernon was not protecting free speech. He was strategically framing the narrative. By forcing the room to listen, he was validating the accusation. He was legally and socially pinning me to the wall, letting the poison seep into every corner of the room so there would be no doubt left in anyone's mind. Wade stood taller, emboldened by the patriarch's protection. He looked around the room, making eye contact with the wealthiest people in the state, his expression shifting into one of righteous, wounded dignity. "You can relax," Wade said, his tone dripping with calculated martyrdom. "I do not want a single dime of your trust funds. You can keep your offshore accounts, your corporate shares, and your sprawling estates. I am not here to extort you, and I am not here to ask for a payout." He turned back to me, his eyes dead and unfeeling, delivering the final fatal blow of his script. "I came here to take back my child." With those 10 words, the reality of my existence inverted. I was no longer the triumphant wife preparing to announce the next generation of a dynasty. I was the defendant standing barefoot in a coliseum, stripped of my honor, surrounded by a jury of wolves who had finally been handed the exact excuse they needed to tear me apart. The echo of the stranger's final words had barely settled into the heavy air when the physical assault occurred. It was not the brute force of a street fight, but the sharp, calculated strike of high society. Celeste moved with the terrifying grace of a predator. She crossed the short distance between us in 3 fluid strides, her silver satin gown rustling like dry leaves. She raised her hand, weighed down by generations of heirloom diamonds, and struck me directly across the face. The slap rang out with a sickening, percussive snap that seemed to bounce off the vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers. My head snapped to the side. A searing heat exploded across my left cheek, instantly blooming into a fiery welt. But the physical pain was entirely secondary. That strike was not a loss of temper. It was a formal, public branding. By striking me in front of 200 of the most influential people on the eastern seaboard, my mother-in-law was stamping a permanent seal of guilt onto my flesh. She was telling every senator, every hedge fund manager, and every gossiping socialite in the room that I was exactly the filthy, deceptive creature she had always warned them about. "Get her out of my house," Celeste hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that carried farther than a scream. "You disgusting, wretched fraud," before I could even raise a hand to my burning cheek. Audrey lunged into the fray. She did not bother with whispers. She wanted the cheap seats to hear. "Miles, you have to divorce her right this second," Audrey shrieked, her voice pitched in a frantic, theatrical hysteria. She gestured wildly toward the stranger standing completely unbothered near the head of the table. "Look at this absolute disaster. If you do not cut her loose tonight, our family will be the absolute laughingstock of the entire coastal region by tomorrow morning. Every country club from here to Palm Beach will be tearing our name apart. She brought her gutter trash life right into our dining room." I looked around, my vision blurring with unshed tears of pure adrenaline and panic. The guests, the people who had just been politely clapping for our anniversary, had transformed into a pack of silent, hungry wolves. A few of the older, supposedly more refined guests turned their heads away, feigning polite discomfort. But beneath the edge of the white linen tablecloths, I saw the undeniable, cold glow of smartphone screens. They were recording me. They were capturing my public execution to share in their exclusive group chats. My dignity, my hard-earned reputation, everything I had fought my entire life to build, was being shredded into microscopic pieces for their evening entertainment. I was suffocating under the crushing weight of their collective judgment. In the midst of this suffocating panic, my eyes darted down to the mahogany table, my survival instinct. The same analytical brain that hunted corporate fraud for a living abruptly took over the controls. I stared fiercely at the glossy ultrasound image Wade had thrown down like a trump card. My vision tunneled, blocking out the shouting and the flashing cameras. I looked at the black and white static of the image. It was undeniably my scan. I recognized the distinct curvature, the tiny, blurry shape of my 14-week-old child. But as my eyes moved to the top right corner of the paper, a cold, jagged spike of pure terror drove itself directly into my spine. There, printed in faint, pixelated gray ink, was a specific alphanumeric code and a tiny stylized shield icon. It was the watermark for the secure patient portal of my private medical clinic. The clinic did not hand out physical copies with that specific watermark during appointments. They printed on high-gloss photo paper without the digital portal tags. That specific icon only appeared when a user logged into the online web portal, viewed the digital file, and hit the print screen command from a web browser. A wave of profound, sickening realization washed over me. This was not merely a case of a stranger making up a lie. This was not a random extortion attempt. Someone had purposefully, maliciously bypassed two-factor authentication, hacked into my highly restricted medical files, downloaded my most intimate biological data, and handed it to a hired actor. The person who wanted to destroy me had not just watched me from afar, they had digitally crawled inside my doctor's office. This needs to be handled privately, and it needs to be handled immediately, Vernon announced, his baritone voice slicing through the rising chaos. He stepped forward, no longer acting like a father, but like a chairman containing a crisis. He barely acknowledged me before fixing his attention on his son. "Miles," Vernon commanded, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate. "We are shutting this party down. You will step into my study. I will have Martin draft the separation papers within the hour. You will sign them tonight. We will freeze her out, control the press narrative by morning, and protect the family trust. Do you understand me? You need to cut the cancer out before it kills the host." The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. All eyes shifted from my burning face to my husband. Miles stood frozen next to me. He was staring at the scattered photographs on the table, looking at the image of me standing outside the hotel, looking at the horrifyingly accurate medical documents. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. The silence stretched into a torturous eternity. In that cavernous, agonizing pause, a massive, terrifying void opened up beneath my feet. He is going to believe them, I thought, my heart fracturing in my chest. He is looking at the evidence, and he is going to let them throw me to the wolves. I am going to lose the man I love. I am going to lose the father of my child. I am going to be cast out into the freezing night, pregnant, publicly humiliated, and branded an adulterous fraud by a machine with infinite resources. The absolute despair threatened to pull me under. I had never felt so entirely, dangerously alone in my entire life. 4 seconds. 5. Then, Miles finally moved. He did not look at his mother. He did not acknowledge his sister. He completely ignored the commanding stare of his father. Instead, he reached out with slow, deliberate precision and picked up the thick manila folder from the table. The room was so quiet, I could hear the rough texture of the paper sliding against the polished wood. My husband stood up to his full, imposing height, his shoulders squaring, his jaw locking into a rigid, terrifying line of pure granite. The golden boy of the barren empire was gone, replaced by something entirely different, something cold and lethally focused. He took a single step forward, placing himself physically between me and the rest of the world, preparing to do the one thing absolutely no one in that room could have ever anticipated. Miles held the thick manila folder up toward the harsh, glaring light of the crystal chandelier above us. He did not turn to look at me. He did not demand an explanation or hurl an accusation. His focus was entirely consumed by the papers in his hands. I watched his eyes scan the medical printouts, tracking line by line with the same terrifying, predatory focus he used when dissecting a hostile corporate takeover. His thumb rubbed against the corner of the glossy photograph, feeling the weight and texture of the ink. The silence in the room stretched so tight it felt ready to snap. Suddenly, a short, sharp breath escaped his chest. It was not a sigh of defeat. It was a laugh, a cold, humorless, hollow sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He dropped the entire stack of documents back onto the ruined white linen of the dining table. The formatting on this lipid panel is from a proprietary software update the clinic rolled out exactly 2 weeks ago, Miles stated, his voice ringing with absolute, lethal clarity. Yet the timestamp on the top right corner claims this was printed in late October. Furthermore, the shadow cast by the street lamp in this photograph of my wife is falling to the east. That is physically impossible on that specific block of the St. Regis at 8 o'clock in the evening. The lighting has been artificially mirrored. A sharp murmur rippled through the guests. Miles did not give them a single second to process the revelation. He pivoted sharply, locking eyes with the broad-shouldered man standing near the entrance. "Davis," Miles barked, addressing the head of the estate's private security detail. "Lock the main gates right now. Drop the steel perimeters. I want this entire property sealed off." The security chief blinked, utterly bewildered, and instinctively looked toward Vernon for permission. Miles slammed his open palm against the mahogany table, rattling the silver champagne buckets. "I said, lock the gates. Nobody leaves this estate. I want every single security camera, from the driveway to the private beach, backed up to an external hard drive right this second. Do not let a single member of the catering staff, the valet team, or a single guest in this room step 1 foot off the grounds." He reached into his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out his phone. He bypassed the family fixers and dialed a number I recognized from his private corporate contacts. He put the phone on speaker, holding it up so the entire room could hear the dial tone ringing through the silence. "Marcus, it is Miles," he said the moment the line connected. "I need your digital forensics team at Seaglass Hall as soon as possible. Bring whatever you need to preserve the network logs and camera backups. We have an active breach involving stolen medical records and fabricated evidence." He ended the call without waiting for a response and instantly dialed a second number. "David, wake up your legal team," Miles commanded. "We may be looking at wire fraud, identity theft, medical privacy violations, and extortion. I want emergency filings ready by morning." The atmosphere in the room violently inverted. The wealthy guests who had been discreetly recording my humiliation just moments prior suddenly looked absolutely terrified. I saw several senators and hedge fund managers hastily deleting videos from their phones, suddenly realizing that by documenting the event, They had accidentally made themselves potential witnesses to a massive, coordinated federal crime. The dinner party was no longer a stage for my public execution. Miles had weaponized the room and transformed it into an active, locked-down crime scene. Vernon Barron stepped forward, his face flushing a dangerous, volatile shade of purple. The patriarch was losing control of the narrative, and it terrified him. "You are acting like a lunatic," Vernon roared, his deep voice shaking the glass centerpieces. "You are embarrassing this entire family over a stranger's accusation. Stop this theatrical nonsense. Sign the separation papers tonight. Sign the succession agreement right now, or you walk away from the Barron Harbors Development Group forever. You will lose everything you have ever worked for." Vernon snapped his fingers sharply. The family lawyer, Martin, scurried forward like a frightened rat, sliding a thick leather-bound folder across the table toward my husband. It was the succession contract. It was the master key to the Barron Empire. The document that guaranteed Miles his position as the ultimate heir to billions of dollars in real estate and offshore trusts. Miles looked down at the leather folder. He picked it up with both hands. He did not open it. He did not read a single line. With a sudden, violent movement, Miles ripped the thick binding straight down the middle. He tore the heavy, watermarked pages into ragged halves, then tore them again, letting the shredded pieces of his inheritance flutter to the marble floor like dead leaves. "Consider my resignation effective immediately," Miles said, his voice entirely stripped of emotion. Celeste let out a raw, unfiltered shriek that sounded more animal than human. "You are throwing away your entire future. You are destroying generations of power and legacy for a manipulative outsider who never belonged in this family." Miles closed the distance between him and his mother in one massive, terrifying stride. He stopped inches from her face. I had never seen my husband look so dangerous. "If you ever lay a hand on my wife again, I will personally see to it that you spend the rest of your miserable life dealing with aggravated assault charges," Miles promised, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "This is not a family disagreement. This is not about honor or pedigree. This is a targeted, premeditated criminal conspiracy. Someone in this room paid a stranger to hack my wife's medical records and threaten the life of my unborn child." I shifted my gaze toward Wade, the man who had stormed into the room with rehearsed. Arrogant confidence was now physically shrinking into his suit. The smugness had entirely evaporated, replaced by a pale, sweating panic. His eyes darted frantically toward the massive oak doors, then toward Audrey, then toward the wall of security guards now blocking the exits. Wade had clearly been promised a quick hit, a shocked and paralyzed family, a rapid divorce, and a clean getaway with a massive payout. He was absolutely not prepared to be locked inside a billionaire's fortress with a furious executive calling in federal cybercrime investigators and locking down the perimeter. "Hey, man," Wade stammered, taking a clumsy step backward, bumping into a waiter. "I just came to say my piece. I have a flight to catch in 2 hours. You cannot hold me here against my will." "You are not going anywhere," Miles told him, not even bothering to look in his direction. "You are going to sit in that chair until the authorities arrive, and then you are going to explain exactly who funded this performance. If you try to run, security will stop you before you reach the door." The absolute chaos of the Barron family exploded around us. Audrey was hyperventilating, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face. Vernon was screaming at the security chief to open the gates, while the chief stood frozen, terrified of disobeying the man who actually signed his paychecks. Celeste was sobbing in sheer, unadulterated rage, realizing that the empire she had tried to protect was collapsing inward. Miles turned his back on his father. He turned his back on his mother, his sister, and the entire toxic ecosystem of generational wealth that had defined his existence since birth. He walked over to where I stood. His broad chest was heaving, and I could see his hands shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the massive surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He reached out and gently took my hand. His fingers were warm, solid, and incredibly grounding. He looked at the red, burning mark on my cheek, his eyes softening instantly. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked me softly. His voice meant only for me amidst the screaming room. I nodded. I could not speak. The tears I had been fighting back finally spilled over my eyelashes, stinging the welt on my face, but my heart was soaring. Miles kept his fingers tightly interlaced with mine. We turned away from the head of the table. We walked straight down the center of the grand dining hall. The incredibly wealthy, powerful guests parted for us like the Red Sea, terrified to even make accidental eye contact. We walked past the glittering crystal chandeliers, past the imported caviar melting on silver spoons, past the shredded remains of a billion-dollar inheritance scattered on the floor. We walked out of the massive oak doors of Sea Glass Hall, leaving the suffocating poison of the Barron family behind us. Stepping out into the cool, dark, and beautifully quiet coastal night, we signed a month-to-month lease for a furnished two-bedroom apartment sitting directly above the municipal marina. The space was incredibly small. The air inside smelled faintly of diesel fuel and stale seawater, and the old refrigerator in the corner possessed a constant, rattling hum that vibrated through the floorboards. For the very first time since I married into the Barron dynasty, we were completely severed from their suffocating luxury and immense power. There were no private chefs, no vaulted ceilings, and absolutely no security guards monitoring our movements. We had only each other, a pair of laptops, and a cheap folding table we bought from a local hardware store. The adrenaline from the night of the anniversary party had finally burned off, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. I spent the first 48 hours terrified for my baby. Every time my heart rate spiked, I placed my hands flat against my stomach, praying the extreme stress and trauma would not cause a sudden miscarriage. But as the third morning broke over the gray water of the marina, the paralyzing fear evaporated. It was replaced by something far more familiar to me. The weeping, humiliated victim vanished, and the senior fraud investigator from Harbor Ledger Advisory woke up. I was back in my element. I did not need a billionaire's legal team to tell me how I was framed. I simply needed the data. Miles had managed to secure high-resolution digital scans of the entire manila folder Wade had thrown onto the dining table before we walked out of the estate. I laid the digital files out across my laptop screen. My former colleague, Tessa Rowe, was still working at Harbor Ledger. I called her at 6 in the morning and explained the exact situation. Tessa did not ask for a retainer or a formal contract. She simply asked me to send the files over an encrypted connection and promised total discretion. We started our hunt with the physical documents. Wade had presented printed copies of my clinical prenatal records. To a layman, a printed piece of paper is just black ink and wood pulp. To a forensic analyst, it is a detailed map. Tessa ran a microdot analysis on the high-resolution scans. Modern commercial printers leave microscopic, nearly invisible yellow dots scattered across every single page they print, permanently encoding the serial number of the machine and the exact time the document was generated. Tessa called me back 3 hours later. "I pulled the serial number from the pages," Tessa said, her voice dropping to a serious, hollow whisper. "I ran it through a commercial equipment registry. The printer that produced your forged medical records is a heavy-duty enterprise laser printer. It is registered directly to the Barron Family Trust Management Suite on the 42nd floor of their downtown corporate headquarters." I looked across the folding table at Miles. His jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. The documents used to destroy my reputation had literally been printed inside his family's inner sanctum. Next, we targeted the medical portal breach. I formally requested the raw server access logs from my healthcare provider, demanding the administrative data under federal privacy laws. The logs showed that my private patient account had been accessed precisely 3 times during the week before the party. The unauthorized user had downloaded my ultrasound images and my diagnostic panels. They had used a commercial virtual private network to mask their location, but they made a critical, arrogant mistake. They had allowed the connection session to time out and reconnect for a fraction of a second on an unprotected local internet protocol address. I traced that leaked address. It did not point to a rogue hacker in a dark basement. It pointed to a commercial wireless router registered to a high-end commercial property. It was the router for Radiant Wellness, an ultra-exclusive concierge dermatology and spa clinic located in the city center. It was the exact same clinic where Audrey Barron spent every single Tuesday and Thursday afternoon receiving expensive skin treatments. "Audrey," I said aloud, staring at the glowing screen as a sickening realization washed over me. She did not just hear a rumor. She was sitting in a mud wrap while someone on her payroll hacked into my obstetrician's server. The fabricated photographs were the easiest piece of the puzzle to mathematically destroy, yet the most chilling to understand. I exported the images of Wade and me sitting in the dark sedan into a digital manipulation software. I isolated the contrast levels and examined the pixel density around the edges of my hair and my jawline. The digital noise did not match the background environment. It was a highly sophisticated composite image. I spent 6 hours digging through the internal Barron family photo albums, which were stored on a shared cloud drive that my account still had access to. I finally found the source material. It was a candid photograph taken during a 4th of July barbecue at the family compound in the Hamptons. In the original photo, I was sitting in a patio chair, looking down at my phone. The architect of this nightmare had flawlessly cut my face and upper body out of that private family photo, adjusted the artificial lighting to mimic a street lamp, and grafted me into the passenger seat of Wade's car. The background of the car itself was pulled from a security camera feed overlooking a VIP event parking lot. It was a digital assassination executed with terrifying precision. While I was tearing apart the digital fabric of the lie, Miles was hunting the money. He had formally resigned, and his access to the primary Barron corporate accounts had been aggressively revoked by his father within minutes of us leaving the estate. However, Miles had spent a decade building the deep architecture of those financial systems. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, and he knew how to access the shadow ledgers used for discrete family expenditures. He sat rigidly in his chair, his eyes tracking lines of code and routing numbers across his screen. "Found it," Miles said quietly, turning his laptop toward me. He pointed to a newly incorporated limited liability company called Stonepath Hospitality Services. It had been registered exactly 1 month ago. The sole managing director listed on the corporate paperwork was a shell entity located in an offshore tax haven. But the initial funding for Stonepath had been routed directly from a discretionary philanthropic fund completely controlled by the Barron family. "Look at the outgoing wires," Miles instructed, his voice razor-sharp. 3 days before our anniversary party, Stonepath Hospitality Services had authorized a domestic wire transfer. They sent exactly $75,000 to a regional checking account. The name on the receiving account belonged to Wade Coulter. "They paid him," I breathed, feeling a fresh wave of ice-cold anger coursing through my veins. "They wired him $75,000 to walk into that dining room and claim my baby." "It gets worse," Miles replied, his expression entirely devoid of any warmth. He pulled up a secondary screen. Through a private investigator contact he trusted implicitly, Miles had subpoenaed the cellular tower connection data for Wade's burner phone number. He cross-referenced Wade's location data with the known cellular data of Martin Keene, the ruthlessly loyal family lawyer who had practically shoved the divorce papers into Miles's hands at the party. The digital map on the screen displayed 2 distinct overlapping red circles. Martin Keene's company phone and Wade Coulter's device had pinged off the exact same rural cellular tower simultaneously on 2 separate occasions during the 2 weeks leading up to the party. Both clandestine meetings occurred late at night, at a remote highway diner located 40 miles outside the city limits. The illusion of a random stalker or a chaotic extortion plot was completely shattered. We were not dealing with an opportunist. We were staring at the blueprints of a highly coordinated, incredibly expensive, and deeply personal destruction campaign. The people who had smiled at me over crystal wine glasses The family that had aggressively demanded I produce a proper heir had sat in boardrooms and quietly financed my ruin. They had utilized their corporate printers, their luxury spa appointments, their philanthropic funds, and their legal counsel to orchestrate a lie designed to strip me of my marriage, my reputation, and my child. Every single data point, every timestamp, and every routing number pointed directly back into the beating heart of the barren empire. The enemy was not a stranger at the door. The enemy was the family I had married into, and they knew exactly how to dismantle my life. They just did not realize that they had picked a fight with a woman who knew exactly how to trace their footsteps in the dark. Less than 48 hours after we walked out of that sprawling estate, Miles received a secure phone call. His private investigators had intercepted Wade Coulter at a regional airstrip 2 states away. Wade had been attempting to board a private charter flight to the Caribbean, carrying a duffel bag stuffed with expensive clothes and a newly issued passport. They did not involve local law enforcement. Instead, they brought him to a highly discreet, windowless conference room located in the basement of an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. Miles and I drove there in total silence. When we walked into that freezing room, Wade was pacing frantically. He wore a rumpled designer shirt, sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights. Initially, he tried to maintain his arrogant facade, clinging desperately to whatever legal protection he assumed his wealthy employers would provide. He refused to name anyone, insisting he was just a concerned citizen bringing the truth to light. I did not yell. I simply opened my leather briefcase, pulled out the printed wire transfer logs from Stonepath Hospitality Services, and slid them across the cold metal table. I tapped my finger directly on the routing number that connected the Barron Family Discretionary Fund to his personal checking account. I met his eyes and calmly told him he was facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. I calmly explained that the billionaires who hired him would absolutely let him take the entire fall, burying him under a mountain of high-priced litigation while they walked away completely clean. The remaining bravado instantly drained from his face. He collapsed into a metal folding chair and began to talk. Wade confessed that his entry point into our nightmare was Audrey. He was not a sophisticated corporate spy or a master manipulator. He was a mid-level degenerate with a crippling, out-of-control gambling addiction. He owed nearly $200,000 to an underground syndicate operating out of a private poker room that Audrey's social circle occasionally frequented for illicit entertainment. Audrey had learned about his massive debt through a mutual acquaintance and approached him with a lifeline. She promised to wipe his slate completely clean and hand him an additional $75,000 in cash if he agreed to memorize a specific script, review a dossier of my personal habits, and play the role of the scorned lover at our anniversary dinner. However, Audrey was merely the foot soldier in this operation. The true architect was far more calculating. When Miles and I returned to our cramped apartment by the marina, the revelations pushed us to dig deeper into the legal architecture of his family's wealth. Miles used an encrypted portal to pull up the most recent amendments to the Barron Family Trust. These documents had been quietly updated and signed by the board of directors exactly 3 weeks after we had publicly announced our engagement. As his tired eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, the color completely vanished from his face. He turned the laptop toward me, his finger tracing a newly inserted, highly specific clause. The document stated that if the biological paternity of any heir born into the marriage was legally contested or brought into public dispute during the duration of the union, that specific child's succession rights and access to the generational wealth would be immediately frozen indefinitely. The funds would remain entirely inaccessible pending a multi-year, highly publicized tribunal conducted by the board of directors. A deep, freezing horror settled into my bones. The entire spectacle at the dinner party was never simply about humiliating me or forcing a rapid divorce. It was a surgical, financial decapitation. They staged the public accusation so that the corporate board would have immediate legal grounds to lock my unborn child out of the multi-billion-dollar empire before it even took its first breath. They wanted to ensure my child would never touch a single dime of the family legacy. Wade's confession filled in the remaining, sickening gaps of the master plan. He admitted that during a clandestine meeting with Martin Keene, the family lawyer had slipped up and mentioned the ultimate endgame. Celeste had designed the entire extortion plot. She needed the scandal to be so violently public and irrefutable that Miles would be forced into a rapid, unsparing divorce to save his own reputation. Once I was entirely out of the picture, Celeste planned to aggressively push Miles back into the waiting arms of Lena Sloan. The Sloan family controlled a massive global shipping conglomerate. A marriage between Miles and Lena would instantly finalize a colossal, transnational merger that the Barron Harbors Development Group had been desperately trying to secure for over 10 years. My existence, and the existence of my unborn baby, was stalling a multi-billion-dollar corporate alliance. My destruction was simply categorized as a necessary business expense to finalize a merger. Wade also surrendered the final piece of the medical puzzle. Audrey did not hack the clinical servers herself. She utilized a high-end corporate fixer to approach a mid-level administrative assistant working at my highly secure concierge medical facility. This assistant was secretly drowning in aggressive medical debt for a sick relative. Audrey's operative offered the desperate woman $25,000 in untraceable cash simply to hand over her administrative login credentials for exactly 2 hours. That brief window was all the fixer needed to bypass the security protocols, download my ultrasound images, and steal the clinic's internal formatting templates. What began as a toxic family feud had officially escalated into an organized, heavily funded violation of federal health privacy laws. As we connected the massive dots on our makeshift evidence board, a highly complex picture of my father-in-law emerged. Vernon was a ruthless corporate titan, but he fundamentally abhorred messy, criminal liabilities that could attract federal regulators. Reviewing Martin Keene's heavily coded email correspondence, we realized Vernon had authorized the initial funding for a vague operation designed to teach me a harsh lesson and encourage my quiet departure. However, he had deliberately kept himself entirely isolated from the operational details. He likely expected his wife and daughter to orchestrate a forged email chain or a staged, embarrassing photograph to create a manageable, contained scandal. He absolutely did not know that his family had weaponized his money to commit federal felonies by hacking medical servers and fabricating clinical documents. He had turned a blind eye, allowing the venom to brew. But the sheer staggering scale of the criminality was entirely Celeste's independent masterpiece. We spent 3 grueling days piecing together this monstrous conspiracy, compiling a mountain of irrefutable digital and financial evidence. On the evening of the 4th day, a sharp, incredibly authoritative knock echoed on our flimsy front door. We were not expecting anyone. Miles approached the door cautiously, checking the peephole before slowly unlocking the deadbolt. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, leaning heavily on a custom silver-handled cane, was a woman who rarely left her isolated fortress in the Berkshire Mountains. It was Evelyn Barron. She was Miles's grandmother, the true, terrifying matriarch of the dynasty, whose silent approval could still make or break massive corporate empires. She stepped into our tiny apartment without waiting for an invitation, her sharp, calculating eyes scanning the cheap furniture and the laptops glowing with stolen data. She wore a tailored black cashmere coat and an expression of pure, unadulterated steel. She did not offer a warm greeting or a comforting hug to her grandson. She looked directly at me, acknowledging the fierce, unyielding fight in my posture. Evelyn sat down deliberately at our folding table, resting her wrinkled, diamond-adorned hands over the top of her cane. She spoke with a voice that carried the heavy weight of a century of ruthless power. I have watched my son and my daughter-in-law poison this family legacy for 3 decades, Evelyn stated, her tone devoid of any familial warmth. They hide their immense cruelty behind the convenient shield of protecting our reputation. I remained silent for years, believing the rot would eventually correct itself. But watching them attempt to destroy an innocent woman and completely disinherit my great-grandchild using fabricated medical records is the final, unforgivable transgression. They have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. Evelyn looked at me, a chilling, deeply predatory smile slowly forming on her aged face. I control the ultimate proxy voting power over the primary family trust, she revealed, her eyes locking onto mine. It is a reserve I have held for over 40 years. They think they hold the keys to the kingdom, but they are mistaken. It is time the Barron family answered for what they have done. Kayla, and I am here to give you the leverage to bring them down. I possessed more than enough forensic evidence to march into a federal prosecutor's office and bury my in-laws under a mountain of criminal indictments. But I deliberately chose to hold my fire. Filing a lawsuit immediately would have triggered their massive public relations machine and unleashed an army of highly paid defense attorneys tasked with stalling the legal process for a decade. I understood the psychology of the ultra-rich intimately. Women like Celeste Barron only make their most catastrophic, fatal errors when they are absolutely convinced they have already won the war. I needed her to feel incredibly safe. I needed her to believe that her brutal tactics had successfully broken my spirit, with Evelyn secretly backing our play from the shadows. Miles and I agreed to attend a private family mediation session. Vernon had arranged the meeting at the sprawling downtown offices of their primary corporate law firm. We dressed the part of a thoroughly defeated couple. I wore a plain, oversized beige sweater, deliberately skipping my makeup routine to let the dark circles of pure exhaustion show vividly under my eyes. Miles let his broad shoulders slump, adopting the posture of a deeply fatigued, broken man who had finally realized he could not fight his family's infinite resources and just wanted the nightmare to conclude in silence. We walked into the mahogany-paneled conference room projecting total surrender, pretending we were there to quietly negotiate the terms of our departure from the Barron Empire. Before we even stepped foot into that building, my former colleague Tessa had engineered a brilliant digital snare. She created a heavily encrypted file link, naming the document with my specific patient identification number and labeling it as the absolute final, unredacted copy of the disputed prenatal records. Tessa embedded a highly sophisticated tracking script deep inside the file's metadata. During a brief, tense recess in the mediation, Miles forwarded the secure link directly to the family's shared digital legal portal, claiming it was the last piece of medical discovery they needed to review before we signed an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. Less than 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated softly against my leg beneath the conference table. Tessa had sent a single, triumphant message. Audrey had taken the bait. She had opened the decoy file directly from her personal tablet, connecting through the law firm's secure wireless network. By taking that specific action, my sister-in-law unwittingly confirmed her active, ongoing possession of the stolen medical data. She had just digitally fingerprinted herself at the scene of the crime, providing irrefutable proof that she was still holding the hacked files on her personal device. When the mediation reconvened, I sat directly across from Martin Keene. The seasoned family lawyer looked entirely too pleased with himself, adjusting his expensive silk tie and speaking to me in a patronizing, soothing tone usually reserved for placating irrational children. I pushed a blank piece of legal paper across the table and looked at him with an expression of feigned, desperate confusion. I asked him directly how they could possibly justify spending such an exorbitant amount of money just to ruin my life and humiliate my husband. Martin offered a dry, condescending chuckle. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, completely blind to the trap I had laid. "You have to understand the broader picture, Kayla," Martin stated, his voice dripping with arrogant confidence. "The $75,000 paid to Mr. Coulter was never a personal attack against you. It is simply categorized as a standard family protection expense. We have a fiduciary duty to eliminate aggressive liabilities that threaten the integrity of the bloodline and the trust." I kept my face entirely blank, suppressing the massive surge of adrenaline rushing through my veins. My phone, resting face down on the polished table just inches from his hands, was actively recording the entire session. The chief legal advisor for the Barron Empire had just openly admitted to treating criminal extortion and a deliberate smear campaign as routine business costs. He had effectively placed the burden of his own actions squarely on himself. The mediation bought us exactly what we needed: uninterrupted time and the perfect illusion of our compliance. While the lawyers spent the next 5 days slowly drafting the final separation contracts, I dove headfirst into the digital ledgers of the Barron Family Philanthropic Foundation, since they believed I was completely broken and backing down. Their internal security protocols monitoring Miles's dormant administrative accounts had grown incredibly lax. Sitting at the cheap folding table in our cramped marina apartment, I traced the massive money trail far beyond the initial payment given to Wade. I uncovered a horrifying, systematic pattern of corruption hiding brilliantly behind the pristine facade of high society charity. Massive financial distributions, officially labeled as community event grants and urban renewal subsidies, were actually being routed through a complex web of obscure shell companies. I tracked those specific funds directly to the medical clinic fixer, the private investigators who had stalked me for months, and the digital forensics team that had flawlessly doctored the hotel photographs. The Barrons were actively using tax-exempt charitable funds meant for the public good to finance a highly organized, federal crime ring designed exclusively to destroy my life. The final devastating piece of the puzzle arrived through a sheer stroke of luck and Miles's relentless digging into the archived server communications. He intercepted a heavily encrypted, deleted email sent directly from Celeste to the patriarch of the Sloan shipping empire. The message was dated exactly 2 days before our disastrous anniversary party. In the email, Celeste explicitly promised that once Miles was successfully divorced and brought back into the proper family orbit, Lena Sloan would be immediately appointed to a highly coveted seat on the Barron Advisory Board. This appointment would effectively solidify the massive corporate merger they had been aggressively chasing for nearly a decade. The entire elaborate plot to destroy my reputation and disinherit my unborn baby was not simply a malicious family vendetta fueled by class prejudice. It was a calculated, incredibly cold transactional business strategy directly tied to massive commercial interests. Staring at the glowing screen of my laptop, my strategy completely shifted. I realized that hitting them with a standard civil lawsuit or quietly handing the evidence over to the authorities would only result in a long, drawn-out legal battle behind closed doors. They would pay a massive fine, sacrifice a few lower-level executives, bury the story with aggressive non-disclosure agreements, and continue to rule their empire from their coastal estates. I did not want their money, and I did not want a quiet settlement. I wanted to completely dismantle the foundational pillars of their power. I formulated a plan to attack the exact things the Barron family worshipped above all else: their pristine public image, their unquestioned corporate governance, and their absolute, terrifying ability to control the narrative of their own legacy. To execute a true, devastating reversal, I needed an audience far larger and significantly more powerful than the sycophants who had attended our anniversary dinner. I needed the ultimate, inescapable stage. I pulled up the Barron family's public social calendar. Exactly 2 weeks from the date of our fake mediation, the family was scheduled to host the Barron Foundation Winter Gala. It was universally known as the most prestigious, exclusive philanthropic event of the entire season, held in the grand ballroom of the city's largest historical museum. Every major investor, political ally, board member, and corporate partner in their massive network would be in attendance. Dressed in their finest formal attire, ready to write massive checks and celebrate the family's supposed generosity and moral superiority. That was the exact location where the untouchable reign of the Barron family would end. I was going to walk into their glittering, impenetrable fortress, not as a broken victim begging for a financial settlement, but as the meticulous architect of their absolute, public destruction. I walked into the grand ballroom of the City Historical Museum exactly 45 minutes after the main doors opened. The Barron Foundation Winter Gala was operating at its absolute peak. The soaring ceilings, painted with classical frescoes and flanked by towering marble pillars, echoed with the refined chatter of 500 incredibly wealthy individuals. I did not wear sequins, heavy silk, or anything that could be interpreted as apologetic. I chose a tailored, floor-length black crepe gown with a high neckline and severe, structured shoulders. It was stark, minimalist, and completely unforgiving. At 16 weeks pregnant, my body had undeniably changed. The distinct curve of my stomach was proudly visible, a physical testament to the child they had tried to erase. I held my head high, keeping my expression entirely vacant of fear or intimidation. I was no longer the terrified girl who had run from a coastal estate. I was the executioner, and I had come to finish the job. As Miles and I descended the sweeping marble staircase, the opulent noise of the gala began to falter. Heads turned instantly. Whispers rippled violently through the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. Celeste intercepted us near the base of the stairs. She wore a triumphant, icy smile, completely misinterpreting my calm, silent demeanor as the hollowed-out resignation of a broken woman. She clearly believed I had been starved of resources and pushed to the absolute brink. Desperate to avoid a public scene in front of her most important donors and corporate partners, she gestured toward a glass-walled VIP boardroom suspended on the mezzanine level, which directly overlooked the massive gala floor below. "Let us handle this final piece of business with a shred of dignity," Celeste murmured, her voice dripping with synthetic, venomous pity. We followed her up the carpeted steps. Vernon and Martin Keene were already waiting inside the soundproof room. A thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents rested at the center of the polished oak table. Vernon took the lead, easily slipping into the role of the reasonable, pragmatic patriarch. He leaned against the edge of the table, projecting an aura of absolute control. "Kayla, we are prepared to be incredibly generous tonight," Vernon stated, his deep voice smooth and heavily practiced. "Sign the non-disclosure agreements. Relinquish any and all future claims against the Barron family estate and the primary trusts. In exchange, I will personally authorize a wire transfer of $10 million into an offshore account of your choosing by tomorrow morning. You can take the money, move to the West Coast, and start over entirely somewhere else. Once the ink dries on these pages, this entire unfortunate chapter simply disappears, and we all move on with our lives." Miles stepped forward, heavily dropping his broad shoulders. He rubbed the bridge of his nose and exhaled a long, shaky breath that flawlessly mimicked the utter exhaustion of a man who had finally hit his breaking point. He looked at his father with hollow, defeated eyes, making the entire room believe he was ready to return to the profitable safety of the family fold. "I just want this nightmare to be over," Miles muttered, pulling his slim laptop from his leather briefcase. "But I'm not signing a single page of that contract until I review the exact wording of the penalty clauses on a screen I can actually read. My eyes are burning." "Connect me to the boardroom monitor." Martin Keene smiled, practically glowing with the arrogant victory of securing his massive year-end bonus. He eagerly handed Miles the digital audio-visual cable. What Martin Vernon and Celeste completely failed to realize was that the museum's recently upgraded projection system linked the mezzanine boardroom directly to the three colossal, high-definition screens suspended over the main ballroom floor below. Those screens were supposed to be used for the upcoming charity auction presentations. I sat down in a leather chair at the table, deliberately folding my hands over my pregnant stomach, allowing them to believe I was entirely compliant. I waited for the trap to spring. Miles plugged the cable into his machine and struck the entry key. The screens did not display a sterile, heavily redacted legal contract. Instead, an enormous, meticulously designed forensic timeline illuminated the private boardroom and simultaneously flashed across the three massive screens dominating the gala below. The presentation was a brutal, unsparing masterclass in digital tracking. The very first slide showcased the specific Internet protocol address from the Radiant Wellness Spa, overlapping directly with the exact minute my medical portal was breached. The screen then violently transitioned to a blown-up, side-by-side analysis of the hotel photograph, highlighting the fractured pixel layers, the artificial digital noise, and the physically impossible shadow trajectories. Next came the internal Barron trust ledgers. The $75,000 routed from the tax-exempt philanthropic fund to Stonepath Hospitality Services glowed in a bright, accusatory red font, positioned right next to Wade Coulter's personal bank routing numbers. A geographical map appeared immediately after, plotting the two pulsating cellular tower pings that proved Martin Keene had held clandestine meetings with Wade at a rural diner through the soundproof glass of the mezzanine. I watched the prestigious winter gala completely disintegrate. The live string quartet stopped playing in the middle of a measure, their bows freezing over their instruments. 500 guests stared up at the giant screens in absolute, paralyzed shock. I watched a prominent state senator drop his crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the polished marble floor, but the sharp noise was entirely drowned out by the rising, chaotic roar of the crowd. Down at the premium tables strictly reserved for the corporate board of directors and the largest institutional investors, men and women in formal wear began standing up. They were not just looking at the screens, they were frantically ripping open heavy black folders that Evelyn's private security detail had discreetly placed on every single reserved chair just moments before we arrived. They were physically reading the hard copies of the hacked medical logs, the fraudulent wire transfers, and the stolen digital metadata. Inside the VIP room, the oxygen had been entirely sucked out. Vernon stood frozen, his face draining of all color as he stared at the financial suicide playing out on the monitor. His empire of pristine public relations was burning to the ground in real time. Celeste gripped the edge of the oak table so hard, her knuckles turned entirely white. Her jaw unhinged in a state of silent, vibrating panic as she looked down at the hundreds of wealthy peers who were currently realizing she was a criminal architect. But Martin Keene was a relentless legal shark who made a comfortable living twisting the truth. He snapped out of his shock, violently slamming his hand down on the table and pointing a shaking finger directly at Miles. "This is a fabricated, defamatory stunt," Martin shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he paced the room. "This proves absolutely nothing. You have a handful of circumstantial digital footprints and a rogue wire transfer from a massive philanthropic fund. Any mid-level accountant or disgruntled assistant could have authorized that specific payment. You have absolutely zero concrete evidence showing that Celeste Barron directly ordered any of this. It is totally inadmissible hearsay. It is an elaborate coincidence, and I will personally sue both of you for catastrophic corporate defamation." Martin was sweating profusely, grasping blindly at straws, but he was legally correct about the missing anchor. The digital trail proved the barren corporate machinery was illegally used to destroy me, but it did not explicitly feature a signed confession or a direct vocal command from the matriarch herself. He was clinging to the technicality of reasonable doubt, desperately trying to keep the knot from permanently sealing around their necks. They still thought they had a sliver of daylight left to escape. I remained perfectly still in my leather chair, letting Martin Keene's desperate, shouting echoes fade into the heavy silence of the soundproof boardroom. Down below, the 500 guests were staring up at our glass box, waiting for the final verdict. "You are actually right about one thing, Martin," I said, my voice eerily calm, cutting through his frantic pacing. "I have not shown you the final card yet." I reached over to Miles's laptop and pressed a single key. The massive forensic timeline on the ballroom screens vanished. In its place, a simple audio waveform appeared, glowing in a stark white line against a black background. The museum's state-of-the-art surround sound system, meant to amplify symphonies, suddenly broadcast a crystal-clear recording captured directly from my phone during our fake mediation session. Audrey's distinct, arrogant laugh echoed through the grand hall, followed immediately by her voice. "It does not even matter if the public completely buys the story or not," the recorded Audrey sneered, her tone laced with absolute malice. "As long as we make the baby carry the permanent stain of a false bloodline, the board will have no choice but to trigger the moral turpitude clause. We keep the succession line pure. We keep the trust fund totally clean. And she gets thrown out into the street where she belongs." I watched Audrey, who was standing near the front row of the ballroom floor, physically collapse against a cocktail table as her own voice condemned her in front of every socialite and senator she had ever tried to impress, before the crowd could even process the sheer cruelty of her statement. The screens shifted again. A digitally scanned, fully notarized legal affidavit filled the displays. It was signed by the desperate clinic assistant. I read the most damning paragraph aloud into the microphone connected to the projection system, ensuring my voice reached every corner of the museum. The employee swears under penalty of perjury that a corporate fixer associated directly with the Barron family paid her $25,000 in untraceable cash, I announced, my words ringing like a judge reading a final sentence. The fixer explicitly stated that the order to purchase my prenatal data came directly from the top, sanctioned by the matriarch of the family to secure a corporate merger. The final, absolute killing blow did not come from a document. The screens flickered one last time, transitioning to a live, secure video feed. Wade Coulter appeared, sitting in the stark, windowless conference room of a federal financial investigator. He looked entirely broken, stripped of his tailored suit, wearing a cheap gray sweatshirt. We had offered him a highly specific immunity deal in exchange for his live testimony tonight. "My name is Wade Coulter," he spoke into the camera, his voice shaking but clearly amplified across the ballroom. "I was paid $75,000 by Stonepath Hospitality Services, a shell company funded by the Barron Charity Fund. But I did not act alone. I sat in a rural diner on 2 separate occasions with Martin Keene. He handed me the forged medical documents. He gave me the script. And he explicitly told me that Celeste Barron personally approved every single dollar of my payment to ensure her son's marriage was destroyed." The VIP boardroom erupted into absolute madness. Martin lunged toward the laptop, but Miles easily stepped in front of him, shoving the lawyer backward with a single, forceful push to his chest. Celeste let out a horrified, guttural gasp, pressing her hands over her face as she looked down at the ballroom. The gala had completely fractured. It was no longer a prestigious charity event. It was the ground zero of a catastrophic corporate implosion. The incredibly wealthy board members, the massive institutional investors, and the international trade partners were not looking at a mere family scandal. They were looking at a highly organized scheme involving federal wire fraud, violations of medical privacy, and the embezzlement of charitable funds. Several major investors were already on their phones, frantically ordering their teams to freeze all assets associated with the Barron Harbors Development Group. Down on the main floor, the crowd parted as Evelyn Barron stepped forward. She leaned heavily on her silver-handled cane, her face carved from pure granite. She did not look up at her son or her daughter-in-law. She looked directly at the cluster of terrified board members scrambling near the front tables. As the primary holder of the controlling proxy votes for the Barron Family Trust, I am exercising that authority now," Evelyn declared. The remaining board members, terrified of federal exposure and desperate to distance themselves, began voicing their support on the gala floor. By the end of the emergency session, Vernon and Celeste had been stripped of their titles, their board seats, and their day-to-day control. Vernon turned to Miles, his face pale and completely devoid of his usual arrogance. "Miles, please," Vernon begged, his voice cracking. "You have made your point. You have the power now. You can take the chairman's seat. We can fix this quietly. We are still your family." I stood up from my chair, walking over to stand shoulder to shoulder with my husband. I looked directly into Vernon's desperate eyes, refusing to accept a single ounce of his pathetic apology. "You do not get to ask for forgiveness," I told him, my voice steady and completely unyielding. "You did not just try to humiliate me. You orchestrated a criminal conspiracy to erase my unborn child from the family record and the line of succession. You tried to bury my baby to protect your bank accounts. There is absolutely no coming back from that." Miles looked at the shattered remains of his parents, then down at the empire that had just been handed to him on a silver platter. He reached out, gently taking my hand, intertwining his fingers tightly with mine. "I do not want your throne. and I do not want your toxic legacy, Miles said. I am waiving any claim to that proxy control, and we are turning over every piece of evidence we presented tonight to the authorities. Kayla and I will be filing suit in the morning for defamation, forgery, medical privacy violations, and financial fraud. We intend to hold you accountable for every dollar of damage you caused my wife and child. We did not wait for their response. We turned our backs on the screaming lawyers and the weeping billionaires, walking out of the glass boardroom and down the sweeping marble staircase. We walked straight out the front doors of the museum, leaving the suffocating, burning wreckage of the Barron dynasty far behind us in the cold winter night. 6 months later, the coastal winds of South Carolina and the towering glass walls of Sea Glass Hall were nothing but a distant, fading nightmare. I was sitting in the small, vibrant backyard of my childhood home in Dayton, Ohio. The air smelled intensely of barbecue smoke and blooming lilac bushes. My father was loudly laughing while flipping burgers on a rusted grill, and my mother was carefully arranging paper plates on a weathered picnic table. There were no crystal chandeliers, no forced, terrifying smiles, and absolutely no billions of dollars hiding in offshore accounts. But as I sat in a simple canvas folding chair, bouncing my perfectly healthy, wildly loved newborn daughter on my knee, I knew I possessed a wealth that the Barron family could never comprehend. Miles walked across the damp grass, handing me a paper cup of lemonade before leaning down to kiss the top of our daughter's head. The empire that had tried to bury her was currently being dismantled piece by piece in federal court, rotting from the inside out by the very lies they had manufactured. We had lost everything they valued, but we had saved exactly what mattered most. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Where are you tuning in from right now? Please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with others. Do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.